Welcome to an edition of our Talking Head series for the Soils Topic Advisory Group for the Land Use and Net Zero Hub, the LUNZ Hub. We have Ellen Fay with us today, who's going to be talking about soil policy. So I'm going to be asking the questions and Ellie's going to be giving us her wisdom on these issues. So first off, Ellie, what is the picture of soil policy across the UK?
Well, soil policy is, if we think of soil policy kind of falling broadly into four camps, that's initially the first being soil health monitoring at a national level. So getting a picture of what state our soils are in, which allows a couple of really important things. It allows us to then monitor progress against a baseline that allows us to set targets for where we believe we should get to in terms of soil health. And it also, based on that picture, allows us to develop other soil policies and to critically to resource them with people, expertise and money to help them be delivered. So that's the first. The second is how we pay for improvement, long-term improvement, which is has traditionally been through subsidizing farmers, for example. But now going forward is focused around incentivizing farmers to deliver better soil health through financial incentives. So if you think of incentives being around long-term improvement, the way that governments typically address degradation, halting degradation or remediating when harm has been caused is through regulation. So that's the kind of legal route to governments taking responsibility and helping others to take responsibility for not causing harm. And then there's the kind of softer approach that governments can also intervene through, which is through kind of leadership or a joined up approach to offering advice and guidance to help these things be delivered in a consistent way. It's at the moment it's quite hard to see those four elements as a kind of a joined up framework, if you like. They are being developed at different stages in different parts of the country and in different ways. And the past probably decade and a half has been a patchwork of sort of overlaying progress across these different areas across the country. If you're going to look back at how we've got to where we are now, Europe's quite a good sort of overarching starting point, if you like, because most of our policy making had been driven from Europe up to quite relatively recently. Europe proposed a soil framework directive, soil health framework directive, and those directives are the traditional policy instruments for unlocking policy development and resources to deliver those policies. And interestingly, that, of course, necessitates a lot of work around agreeing on what's needed and how and when to deliver what's needed. So it's a very helpful mechanism to get everybody to agree on the fundamentals, if you like. With something like soil, that can be quite difficult because it's traditionally thought of as being very complex at the technical level, but a directive helps to focus minds around the principal things, what's good, what's bad, and how do we interpret results of things in the same way. Sadly, that directive was one of the only European directives to have been rejected out of hand by many EU governments, enough to veto it going any further, including our own government. So soil didn't get off to a good start there, and so policy making, as I say, has been a bit sort of patchy and piecemeal. Then if we go back to the swearing in of the Conservative government 2010 election, they quite quickly released a white paper which set out the principles for the establishment of the Natural Capital Committee, which led to natural capital thinking, which has underpinned a lot of our environmental policy making since then. Natural capital thinking is thinking of nature as an asset or a set of assets which provide benefits to people. So that is a very different way of looking at the environment, because it's almost thinking of the environment in terms of trading, if you like, and what things are worth, what parts of the environment are worth. But that concept now really underpins much of the rationale for caring for the environment today from a policy perspective. And then, of course, we had Brexit 2016 that necessitated recreation of our own environmental policies, critically our farming policies. And why critically our farming policies in terms of soil? Well, because something like 70% of the UK's landmass, those soils are under farming. So that's a massive opportunity. And also, a big proportion, a huge proportion of our payments to Europe to be part of the Union were into the subsidy, but the farming subsidy budget. So the big opportunity and need there actually was the creation of new farming policies. And that combined, actually at the same time, there were some really seminal reports from the Climate Change Commission, which showed that agriculture was both very hard to reach in terms of shifting its impact on the environment, because you're talking about just in England, 200,000 farms plus, so across the UK, hundreds of thousands of farms, all impacting on soil, but each one being a very, very unique business with, unique challenges, unique activities. So a hard to reach sector, but on the other hand, it was brought to light during that period of time that agriculture was actually responsible for something like a third of global emissions. So, a real sense of urgency around how farming and farming policies could help deliver on the climate challenge, if you like. So 2018, then we had the 25-year plan for the environment, which looks to set a trajectory. And in there was a goal for soil of sustainably managed soils by 2030. So we start seeing these new goals for soils, and there have been some past goals. All of this translates through to, this new concept of whether soil can be seen as a public good, and how soil can help deliver other public goods. Initially, soil wasn't seen as a public good because it's got this whole complexity around it, because it is a public good, but it's also privately owned. So the whole kind of legal issues around whether it can be seen as a public good itself. But actually, eventually in 2020, the Westminster government published the Agriculture Act, which allows the government to pay farmers to measure the soil and to look after the soil. So that was, that's a kind of test case, a change moment where, natural capital thinking is embedded in soil policy, and we start moving forward there. Of course, you can't measure you can't manage what you don't measure. Around about the same time, it was demonstrated that of the money spent on monitoring our air, water and soil was receiving a tiny proportion, just 0.4%. So then, these important reports like publications like the 25-year plan for the environment, or then the Environment Act, had a real hard time finding a place for soil, because we didn't have that baseline. We didn't know where we were leaving from and where we were therefore headed to, and we weren't able to set targets. Yeah. So that's the kind of potted history, if you like, of how we've got where we are. And at the moment, there's been loads of energy in new soil policy developments. It's a bit of a patchwork. Some things are more developed in some areas, some in others. Yeah.
So that's a good point. I mean, we're from different nations of the UK. You're based down in England, and I'm based up in Scotland. Which nations of the UK are leading on which areas of policy development?
Yeah, I mean, that's a brilliant question. So I say it's a bit of a patchwork for very logical reasons, because of course different areas have different challenges which lead to prioritization in different ways. But I think the really kind of salient examples of where there's really great leadership would be in Northern Ireland, for example. They have the Soil Nutrient Health Scheme. And that's a process, and that is in the process of sampling every single field across the country. That's super ambitious, and that's the government paying for these for sampling, creating its own baseline, and really getting involved in the detail of soil health from the outset. England was the first to establish the Sustainable Farming Incentive that pays farmers for measuring their soil, as I mentioned before, in the Agriculture Act. Scotland is preparing for their sustainable farming scheme, which is going to pay land managers to sample their soil and to take carbon audits. So they're focusing very much on that. And then Wales has put healthy soil as a key indicator for their Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, which underpins all their farming and environmental policies. So they have this a very visionary approach, really, which is looking far outside the parliamentary cycle. They're looking in terms of centuries, which is hopefully where we all want to get to.
Yeah, it's great. As a soil scientist, to see soils underpinning the health and well-being of the future. That's where it should be. So
really, yeah.
Good on Wales. Yeah.
Good on Wales, yeah.
Yeah. So what are the biggest gaps at the moment for policy creation? What are the biggest opportunities? The other way of saying it is, where are the gaps? What are the biggest opportunities at the moment for policy creation for soils?
Yeah, I mean, as I said, we've talked a bit about this massive opportunity around farming, and helping farmers address those the financial challenges of delivering healthy soils. Because of course, all farmers want healthy soils because that's their greatest asset. But there's myriad pressures on them to keep businesses afloat, to keep to contracts, etc. So that assistance is in everybody's interest. At the same time, so if you think of this incentivization through government as top down, at the same time you've got this whole bottom up movement around regenerative agriculture, which started years ago, but it's been focused in this country around, for example, the groundswell, which is pretty much the Glastonbury Festival of farming. You have thousands now farmers converging on John Cherry's farm in the summer. It used to be a small group of people talking about their passion for soil, etc., and how to farm in this regenerative way. And you think about the word regenerative, it's a very inspiring word when you really think about it. It's what we would all love to see being created. And it's not just farmers now who are meeting at Groundswell, it's researchers, it's NGOs, policymakers are increasingly seeing it as their opportunity to make their next big announcements and to learn from farmers as well. It would be now really wonderful if these two, top down and bottom up, could really converge around some concentrated work to really understand how we evidence the outcomes of regenerative agriculture, which are, these are the practices that essentially farming incentive schemes are going to be paying for, so that we can really understand, what the soil health outcomes are and measure them and measure improvements, which needs, it sounds simple, but it needs a lot of agreement from a lot of different players, and it needs to be simple, and it needs to be workable, and it needs to be true and robust, and needs to take into consideration all these incredible variations around landscapes and farming types and soil types, and soil variability and soil depth, and all of these things that that mean that regenerative agriculture is really delivering for soil and for the environment. So, and it would also put that whole massive opportunity around more sustainable farming on a stronger footing for the long haul. It would help create a more secure place for soil health also on the agenda of businesses outside of farming, who are also seeking to address either their impact on soil health or to invest in soil health and help to pay for that transition. And it would also give confidence to, for example, on the one hand, Treasury, who's paying people's money to help drive this improvement, and on the other hand, people who are popping to the supermarket to buy a loaf of bread and it says it's regenerative on the packet, that actually it genuinely is regenerating. It's not just greenwash. So there's a huge opportunity there. I think there's probably there are opportunities in other areas, for example, around regulation. It would be really interesting to see whether there was any way of having one approach to regulation that did work across nations. I think that's very difficult because regulation protections need to be different in different places and different countries, and the UK have different legal systems. I mean, in the end of the day, regulation is a legal issue. Regulators have powers, so that you have to bear that in mind. But for example, in Northern Ireland, they have a great issue with water contamination, and England, many parts of England, we're looking to resolve flooding issues. So the issues that regulation is looking to address might be different. But for example, could we converge around a common understanding of soil degradation or soil erosion that is nuanced enough to be fair? And fairness is, of course, has to be at the heart of regulation, because, fair to the environment, the taxpayer, but it's also fair to the farmer, who's the one who's being held responsible. So it has to be really robust and enforceable. So regulation is potentially another gap where there's a bit of room for better communication and potentially looking at whether there are any common factors.
Yeah. So you mentioned in that answer and in your previous answers that there's this sort of, you've mentioned a couple of times, there's this top down and bottom up and converging, this action on the ground by farmers and the top down policy. And you mentioned that there's a patchwork of different policies in different nations. So that leads to the question, I mean, should soil policy be devolved? Does it need to be devolved, in your opinion?
Yeah, I think it mostly makes sense for it to be devolved because of those individual challenges. And, we have to remember cultural history and cultural heritage as well is very much bound up with the soil. I think it'd be really interesting to examine whether there are areas, though, for national UK-wide policy development for soil. I mean, today there was the news was very full of fairly calamitous story around global warming, and scientists feeling very disheartened that we're not managing as a global society to rise to the challenge, and very much the message is because things are too piecemeal, because we're not actually taking those more global decisions to move in a certain direction and helping each other to do that. So I think the areas where, you know, soil policy at a national level could really help us think in those terms, in those more ambitious terms, if you like, are going to be around questions of national monitoring. How do we understand the state of our soil across the UK? Obviously, each nation is going to want to concentrate on certain things, but is there a handful of indicators that we could all agree on and do in the same way, so that we can report as a country to larger bodies who are reporting as a larger body, for example, Europe, and then, you know, ultimately globally, can we start to say what the direction of travel is as a nation for our soil? And I think just thinking in those bigger terms is really important, because it signals that we want to rise to that bigger challenge. I think, as I said before, countrywide regulation would be very complex, but it would be interesting to know whether we could think about investing in at least looking at what are the things that as a country we don't want to see happening. And you can see examples of that for example, in Europe, there are a couple of countries who have they have a simple statement that they want no net soil loss. You know, you can agree on some big things, and then potentially each devolved nation could find their way to delivering it.
Yeah, absolutely. So you've mentioned, I mean, when I think about policy making, I think, right, that's politicians. You've just gone off camera, Lee. Ellie?
Oh.
Your camera just closed.
Oh, did it?
Yeah, you're back.
Edit that out. Yeah.
So you've mentioned that yeah, when I think about policy, I think about it being that's somebody else's job. It's government's job to make policy. But is it solely the responsibility of government to make policy?
Well, I mean, policies, I think, are made, they're made everywhere, and we all make policies to some degree, don't we? Because that's essentially the job is of saying, you know, what we think is right, what we think is wrong, and then deciding how to make that happen. I think it's really important that governments also recognise that other people are making soil policies. I'm thinking of other industries, and help provide some leadership to how that happens, in terms of, you know, what are the fundamentals, what are the fundamental frameworks that everybody can work to. That would be very helpful. And you know, we see soil health policies being made in supermarkets and water companies, increasingly even in the investment community. They're looking to create a sense of direction towards something better. Of course, what's really important there is that is underpinned by, you know, some really key critical agreed principles. I think the carbon markets, for example, demonstrate why that's so important, why it's so important that government takes a leadership role to set the frameworks for these things, so that everybody can have confidence that when they're trying to deliver into something positive, that it's actually going to have the desired outcomes. I also think we've touched on this question of, you know, the massive diversity of farms that there are across the country, each one very much kind of driven by individual people, and how it's, you know, so important to find ways to harness all of that wisdom, knowledge, experience, and ambition at that very individual level, and help that to somehow feed into how policy making is made, so that there's that aspect of co-creation and investment, you know, kind of almost emotional investment, that everybody is shared and invested into.
Awesome. So as you know, I've been working in soil science for over 30 years, but I still find the science of soils much less daunting than the policy of soils. So thank you very much for negotiating your way through that and to explaining to all of us how the policy fits in within the different devolved nations of the UK and how it all fits into the international picture. Is there anything that I forgot to ask you, or that you'd like to say that we could that would be beneficial for viewers to hear?
I mean, I think it's important to remember that that there are other actors who are directly involved in the soil, and I think the construction industry is a really good example of that, because we think of it as houses and roads, etc. But actually, the first thing they have to do is deal with soil, and there are some fairly shocking statistics around construction industry's impacts on soil. Specifically, I think our tonnage going to landfill is 50% of that is soil from construction sites, which is whopping.
Yeah.
And in terms of soil carbon balances, soil carbon losses from construction sites are enormous. They are equivalent to emissions from the chemical or the cement industry. They're really, really significant.
Yeah.
And mostly due to, and I don't mean this in a derogatory sense, but literally due to ignorance. It's a sector that doesn't seem to know as much as it would like to about soil and how to, not create those impacts in the first place. I think, just some more information from the scientific community, driven by governments, would be really helpful in updating and publicising better what those impacts are, and helping to avoid them in the first place. And I think probably, again, this question of helping people to all assess the soil in the same way and know what they want from the soil in terms of, we'd like the soil to have to look like this, would be really helpful. So I think what the research community has to offer is massive in those terms, providing that knowledge, wisdom, and those resources to draw on in order for people to start to get their house in order. And I think there's a massive opportunity as well around with the construction industry around biodiversity net gain, for example, which doesn't properly understand soil's place. And we could probably communicate about that better going forward.
Yeah. So lots more to do, lots more for us to contribute to, which is great. It keeps us all in a job.
Exactly, that's right.
Thank you very much, Ellie. We'll draw a line under it there. So thank you very much for taking us through the complex world of soils policy in the UK, and we'll hear more about it later. Thank you very much.